Hi, welcome to week 2 of Roman Civilization. And today, my goal is to give you a brief introduction to some of the organs of the Roman government. These are relevant because they're transformed with the addition of an emperor in the year 31 BCE, formally, actually, in the year 27 BCE. But at any rate, since this massive shift in the power structure is the linchpin behind the way I've organized the course, I do want to give you at least some idea of what the, the top guys like Cicero um, were aiming for in the course of their careers, since those ambitions are valorized so directly in the readings today and by the people who created a number of those readings. Um, Cicero uh, and Tacitus, chief among them, who both served as consuls. So if you could pause this video after you have opened up the worksheet for this week, as well as the two links, one on the Cursus Honorum and the other one on the organs of the Roman Constitution, then restart the video. All right, so I assume you've done that. And the worksheet, it has some key words at the top that will be of use to us. And then the two um, uh, uh, pictures are going to be helpful to me to just lay out the key ideas. Now, I want to start with the Roman Cursus Honorum, and um, and give you just a little bit of an idea of what a wealthy Roman man who was bent on doing more than making a lot of money. These ended up being the kind of people who did the writing. How he saw his career. That young man would, if he was of a kind of family that might end up, predisposing him towards a position in the Senate, he would first serve as a military tribune. Um, and that was, military, that was mandatory, that if you did not show courage in battle, you weren't really fit to lead. So that was just a given. If you did that with some minimum adequacy, or with great distinction, that would speak well. And then, strictly speaking, what we're talking about with a cursus honorum is a course, a run, of offices, of honors, honorum, the course of honors. And the minimal positions for this would be to have been a military tribune, and then at a certain age, being elected as a quaestor. Now, a quaestor, which is misspelled unfortunately on this thing that I'm using, but it's spelled correctly in the key terms on the worksheet, Quaestor. A quaestor is primarily an accountant. They would often have a military appointment, and they would, keep the books to make sure everything's flowing. So not only would you have military experience, but you'd also have a degree of oversight of proper administration of funds. If that went well, that at a slightly increased age, you could then serve as a praetor um, by election again. And a praetor, very often, there's different kinds of them, but very often was a general assigned legions to command on the battlefield and under the direct leadership of one of the two annually elected top officers of the state called the consul. Um, uh, so far, every office that we've had, be it a military tribune or a quaestor or praetor, is, or I'm sorry, or military tribune or quaestor, has come with a power. And the Latin word for that is potestas. But the once you become a praetor, that gives you a different word for the kind of power you've got called imperium. The offices above quaestor on the cursus honorum are imperium-bearing offices, and that meant that you had the power to command legions. The top officers in the state, and there are only 2 elected, this would be kind of the equivalent of our presidency, were consuls. And this was, in the Roman Republic, the very pinnacle, the top that you could ever hope to achieve, really, because you don't want the other things that can happen if you have a higher office to happen, that require that office. But the consuls are both your commanders-in-chief, as well as the chief executive officers of the Senate, and they were kind of the top dogs. They only served 1 year, which meant that nobody was going to get too much power, wouldn't really be able to achieve all that much, and that change overall in the Roman state would be pretty gradual. And so that, strictly speaking, is the cursus honorum. There are other positions that Romans would like to have. One of them was to be the aedile, which you see to the left of the word praetor. If you've been a quaestor, you might serve as an aedile. And an aedile is more or less somebody who's responsible for public works, very often within the city of Rome itself. In practice, this meant that you might put on games, or you might perform repairs to roads or the sewer system, and put your name on a bunch of buildings, refurbished buildings. This was a very good way to curry favor with the Roman people, and since it was a democracy and these were elected offices, past the position with the position of quaestor and up, this was a very good way to start your campaign. Julius Caesar, for example, spent tons of his own money on his aedileship, and so that was a very attractive position for a number of ambitious Romans. The tribune of the plebs is an interesting position as well. You'd have to have been a plebeian, a rich plebeian, but a plebeian nonetheless, to serve in the plebs. And again, technically everything below an equestrian is plebeian. Even the equestrian should be plebeian. The only people really not plebeian are the senators. But at any rate, the tribune of the plebs is a really interesting position because that person is the only person who has the right to veto. That's wherever the word veto comes from. He has the right to veto any edict of the Senate. Now, the Senate, technically speaking, issued opinions. They didn't have the right of law attached to any of their pronouncements, but in practice they were laws. So the tribune of the plebs would be a good position for somebody who is ambitious, and they may well end up becoming praetor and consul, but they would be the kind of person that would curry favor with those people who were still wealthy but in the lower echelons of society. So it might be, more of a common everyday person rather than, a person who's governing for the rich. And then finally 2 more positions worthy of note, here at any rate. One is a censor. Every 10 years the Romans would count your money. And that would assign you to your class, whether you were equestrian or senatorial or plebeian, purely plebeian, not equestrian. And that was called a censor. In Latin it's called a censor. And you'd have to be really distinguished to be named one of the censors every 10 years, and you would have the job of counting up people's property, and that's an important position. People could be found morally unfit to belong to a certain order. And of course, this is kind of a political decision sometimes, but at least in theory, it was only given to the most fair and just men, so that they would be performed disinterestedly. Secondly, dictator. Nobody wants there to be a dictator. A dictator means that things have gotten so screwed up, you need to give somebody plenary powers for a 5-year term. It used to be a 6-month term, but 5-year term, as in the case of Julius Caesar, to make all decisions. They've got the power of life and death over other people. They were attended by a group of men called lictors, and they carried a bundle of sticks with an axe in them called fasces, and those were representatives of their power of life and death. Julius Caesar was famously appointed to a 5-year term in 49 BCE as a dictator, and others like Fabius that you'll be reading about in Polybius were also given the power of dictator. That means that things have gone pretty wrong in the state when that person is put in place, and by and large, people respected it. They would cease to be normal citizens and become superordinary citizens. But until people started destroying the Republic, they always gave up that power. So that is the Cursus Honorum. The other video, or the other picture, which I'll talk about in much less depth, is the Constitution of the Roman Republic. I'd like you to read over these different organs, including the Centuriate Comitia, the Senate, the Comitia Tributa, and Concilium Plebis, and think about how they interact and understand their relationships. You can see bits of the Cursus Honorum are appearing on the right side of that page. But what I wanted you to get out of this is that Roman citizens had a number of political bodies, some of which they could be part of, like Senate, in which case you weren't a part of any of the other parts, but some of which you might be part of multiple ones. Some people might be part of the Comitia Centuriata and the other Comitia or the Concilium Plebis. And they all had various duties and responsibilities. The key thing is that there's no strict analogy to Senate and House of Representatives. They had 3 different popular political bodies below the level of Senate. The Senate was a lifetime appointment, had age and wealth requirements. Their edicts were not strictly having the force of law, but in practice they did. And that these other committees and assemblies were designed to perform different functions, judicial, legislative, and otherwise, within the state. So no thing like regional distribution of, opinion that produce legislation that then the Senate will go consider, and then they'll hash it out in committee to produce laws that then censors or the emperor, then consuls and the emperor will then vote on or ratify or something like that. It's much more broken down, frankly, than that. And so I just call your attention to those organs of state. I expect you to read over the chart with some detail and be able to identify the functions. All right, well, the last thing that I'd like to do is talk about the readings for this week. This week, you're looking at bits from Polybius, the Histories. He's a Greek author of the 2nd century BCE. Cicero and Sallust on the issue of Catiline, giving 2 somewhat different perspectives on the same issue. Quintilian talking about the education of the ideal orator. He's living in the 1st century CE. And then Tacitus, who's reviewing the conduct of the emperors 1 and 2, Augustus and Tiberius, in the first book of his work called the Annals. In all of these writings, I've got a number of different plans for you. First, I want to use the Polybius for you to consider the nature of leadership in Rome. Um, this talks about the Hannibalic War when, at the end of the 3rd century BCE, the Romans were pressed way back on their heels. And they appointed as dictator a man named Fabius, who constructed a strategy, not entirely popular with the Romans, about how to um, best defend themselves from invasion within Italy. And this is power as it's wielded in the Republic. So, and that's going to be a little bit different than in imperial context. Cicero and Sallust are both talking about an issue from the year 63 BCE. Sallust calls it the conspiracy of Catiline, and Catiline against Catiline is a speech purported to be delivered by Cicero in the Senate House in 63 BCE to Catiline and the rest of the senators. Now, Catiline is a guy who was engineering an overthrow of the state. Sallust goes into some of his ideas, the ideas that Catiline was trying to represent. And if nothing else, if you give it like a fair, think what you will about Catiline, but think about the kind of issues and constituencies that he was trying to represent, and it'll give you something like a picture of what was happening in Rome towards the end of the Roman Republic. Quintilian's interesting because, among other things, when he's talking about an educational system for the Romans, he's interested in producing great statesmen. And an orator is somebody who is a good man, skilled in speaking, and his ideal is very much Cicero, ultimately. So I thought that'd be a nice kind of a comment about what a statesman is supposed to be like, and what he's supposed to do. And yet Quintilian is writing this in the 1st century CE. He's writing this in a period where the government has really been fundamentally hamstrung or transformed by the addition of a senator of an emperor at the very, very top. And then Tacitus, well into the imperial period in the 2nd century, he had served as a consul. He's writing his history of Rome, and he's looking primarily at the imperial period. And he talks about Augustus and his successor Tiberius. And so from there you get a perspective from well within the imperial period of how the emperors were regarded as functioning. And this from a guy who was a senator, had been a consul, and with what I might call deeply conservative and old-fashioned attachments. Old-fashioned because they seem to be out of place in his time. So those are the readings for this week, and they're all dealing with the Republic, what it's like to be in it, and the end of the Republic. And hopefully by knowing a little bit more about the Cursus Honorum and the organs of the Roman Constitution, you'll be able to navigate this reading with a little bit more comfort and finesse. All right. I hope you have a great week.